The avoidant has been playing a careful game for years, maybe decades. A delicate balance of push and pull, distance, and just enough closeness to keep partners invested. They've mastered the art of maintaining control through strategic unavailability, of keeping people wanting more while never giving too much. The game worked because they understood the rules better than anyone else. They knew exactly how much to withdraw before offering a breadcrumb of connection. They knew how to keep partners hoping, chasing, accommodating. But games have a fatal flaw. They require the other person to keep playing. And the avoidant got so confident in their control, so secure in their ability to manipulate the dynamic, that they pushed too hard. They withdrew one too many times, dismissed one boundary too many, took one too much for granted. And suddenly, the game is over. Not because you decided to punish them or play hard to get, but because you genuinely stopped caring. The avoidant overplayed their hand, and now they're facing consequences they never believed would actually come. The miscalculation of your investment. The avoidant's entire strategy depends on a fundamental assumption that you will always be there, always willing to try again, always ready to accept them back when they decide to return. They believed your investment was infinite, that your patience had no limit, that your love was unconditional in a way that meant you'd tolerate anything. This miscalculation isn't malicious ignorance. It's defensive blindness. The avoidant couldn't afford to see that your patience was finite, because acknowledging that would mean acknowledging risk. So they convinced themselves that you needed them more than they needed you, that you would wait indefinitely, that their power in the dynamic was absolute and permanent. The miscalculation becomes apparent when the avoidant returns from a withdrawal expecting the usual pattern. They disappear for weeks, offer a casual text, and expect you to light up with relief and gratitude. But this time you don't. Your response is measured, distant, polite, but not warm. The avoidant registers the shift and feels panic they didn't anticipate. They've been here before, in this moment of return, and it's always gone the same way. Your joy at their reappearance, your eagerness to reconnect, your willingness to overlook the abandonment. But not this time. Something has fundamentally changed, and the avoidant suddenly realizes they may have miscalculated how much they could take for granted. The miscalculation of your investment also shows in the avoidant's shock at your boundaries. They're accustomed to you accepting whatever level of relationship they're willing to offer. Part-time presence, minimal commitment, attention on their terms only. Subscribe to understand these relationship dynamics better and learn to recognize when it's time to stop playing games that were never designed for you to win. But now you're stating clearly what you will and won't accept, and the avoidant is confronted with a choice they never expected to have to make. Meet your standards or lose access. They gambled that you'd never actually enforce boundaries, that threats to leave were just expressions of frustration rather than genuine positions. The gamble failed. You're enforcing boundaries, and the avoidant discovers too late that they pushed you past the point where their minimal effort is acceptable. The erosion of your responsiveness. The avoidant trained you over time to be hyper-responsive to their needs, available when they wanted attention, accommodating of their patterns and limitations. They could reach out after silence and receive immediate warmth. They could express a need and see you scramble to meet it. This responsiveness fed their sense of control and validated their strategy. But responsiveness doesn't come from infinite reserves. It comes from hope, from investment, from belief that the relationship has potential. Every time the avoidant withdrew and returned, every cycle of abandonment and reconnection, it depleted your hope and reduced your investment. The avoidant didn't notice the gradual erosion because each individual return seemed to work. They got their validation, received their attention, and assumed the pattern could continue forever. The erosion becomes visible when the avoidant tries their usual tactics and they don't work anymore. They send a late-night text expecting you to engage, but you don't respond until the next day with something brief and unengaged. They suggest getting together, and you're suddenly busy, not making excuses or explaining, just unavailable in the same way they've always been unavailable. They try to initiate intimacy, and you're responsive, but not enthusiastic, present, but not invested. The avoidant feels the difference viscerally. Your responsiveness was the fuel that made their game work, and now that fuel is depleted. They created the depletion through their own behavior, through taking and taking without reciprocating. But they never believed the supply would actually run out. The erosion also manifests in your lack of emotional reaction to their behavior. The avoidant is used to getting a response, whether that's hurt, anger, or desperate attempts to understand and reconnect. Your emotions proved they had impact, that they mattered, that they held power in your life. But now when they withdraw, you don't chase. When they're dismissive, you don't fight for acknowledgement. When they're unavailable, you don't express hurt or frustration. You simply adjust your expectations and redirect your energy elsewhere. This absence of emotional reaction is more devastating to the avoidant than any anger or hurt could be. It suggests you've moved beyond caring enough to be hurt. The game only works if you're emotionally invested in the outcome, and your detachment reveals that investment has been withdrawn. The power reversal recognition. The avoidant structured the entire dynamic around them, having power through their ability to withdraw. They controlled the distance, the pace, the level of intimacy. This control felt like safety and superiority. They weren't vulnerable, weren't dependent, weren't the one who needed more. But power through withdrawal only works when the other person is trying to close the distance. The moment you stop trying, the power structure collapses. The avoidant suddenly realizes that all their control was illusory, dependent on your willingness to play a game they designed. Without your participation, they have no power. They can withdraw, but there's nothing to withdraw from because you're already at a distance. They can create space, but you're not trying to close it. The power reversal hits the avoidant when they recognize that you're now the one controlling the dynamic. You decide when communication happens, how much emotional energy gets invested, whether the relationship continues. The avoidant is suddenly in the pursuing position, testing to see if you still care, trying to gauge your level of investment, wondering if they've lost you. This role reversal is disorienting and terrifying. They've spent their life avoiding being the vulnerable one, the one who needs more, the one at risk of rejection. Now they're suddenly in exactly that position, and they don't have the skills or emotional capacity to handle it. The game worked when they had control, but they've forfeited that control through overplaying their hand. The recognition of power reversal includes the avoidant seeing that you have options they didn't believe you had. They assumed you would always be available because they believed themselves uniquely valuable to you. But now they see you building a life that doesn't center them, making plans that don't include them, finding satisfaction in connections they're not part of. The avoidant confronts the reality that they're not special or irreplaceable, that their presence in your life was a choice you were making rather than a need you had. This recognition destroys their sense of security in the relationship. They operated as if they were doing you a favor by maintaining contact. Now they realize you can withdraw your favor, and without your willingness to engage, they have nothing. The breadcrumbs strategy failure. The avoidant's go-to tactic when they sense distance is to offer breadcrumbs, small gestures of attention or affection designed to reignite your hope and investment without requiring real vulnerability or change from them. A sweet text after weeks of silence. A sudden interest in your life after sustained indifference. A vague suggestion of future plans without actual commitment. These breadcrumbs always worked before. They pulled you back in, made you believe things were improving, bought the avoidant more time to maintain the status quo. But breadcrumbs only work on people who are starving for connection. Once you've found other sources of nourishment, once you've accepted that breadcrumbs aren't sufficient, the strategy becomes powerless. The failure of the breadcrumb strategy is devastating for the avoidant because it was their primary tool for managing the relationship without actually having to change. They relied on being able to throw you a crumb of attention and have you accept it gratefully as evidence of progress. But now when they offer breadcrumbs, you don't respond with gratitude. You respond with polite acknowledgement, or don't respond at all. You're not interested in crumbs. You want a full meal or nothing at all. The avoidant is suddenly faced with the reality that their minimal effort is no longer sufficient, that you've raised your standards, and that keeping you requires actual sustained investment they're not sure they're capable of providing. The breadcrumb failure also reveals to the avoidant that you've learned their patterns. You're no longer fooled by temporary increases in attention that will inevitably be followed by withdrawal. You're not reading into small gestures or building fantasies around vague suggestions. You're taking everything at face value rather than assigning it the meaning you used to assign it. The avoidant can't manipulate your hope anymore because you're not hoping. You're observing, evaluating, and making decisions based on patterns rather than potential. This shift means the avoidant has lost their primary mechanism for maintaining the relationship without commitment, and they're faced with the choice of either genuinely changing or genuinely losing you. The ultimatum moment arrival. The avoidant has successfully avoided ultimatums throughout the relationship by keeping things ambiguous enough that clear lines were never drawn. They maintained plausible deniability about their level of commitment, their feelings, their intentions. This ambiguity served them well because it prevented you from ever pinning them down or making concrete demands. But their overplaying has brought the relationship to a moment of clarity they can no longer avoid. You're no longer interested in ambiguity. You're stating clearly what you need and giving them a choice. Provide it or end things. The ultimatum isn't manipulation or drama. it's genuine boundary setting after reaching the limit of what you're willing to tolerate. The arrival of the ultimatum moment terrifies the avoidant because it forces them to take a position they've spent their entire life avoiding. They can no longer maintain the comfortable middle ground of sort of committed, but not really, kind of together, but keeping options open. They have to decide, and either decision is terrifying. Committing means facing their attachment fears and showing up in ways they've never shown up before. Leaving means losing something they've come to depend on despite their performance of not needing it. The avoidant realizes too late that their strategy of keeping everything ambiguous has led to this moment of forced clarity, and they have no good options because they've pushed you to a point where ambiguity is no longer acceptable. The ultimatum moment also reveals the consequences of the avoidance assumption that they had infinite time to figure things out. They believed they could maintain the status quo indefinitely, that you would wait forever for them to become ready for real commitment. But time ran out. Your patience expired. The grace period they took for granted has ended, and now they're being asked to commit or let go when they're still not ready for either option. The avoidant overplayed their hand by assuming your tolerance for ambiguity was permanent. Now they're facing consequences that feel sudden to them, but which you've been warning about through increasingly clear communications they chose not to hear. Their failure to take your warnings seriously has left them in an impossible position of their own creation. The replacement anxiety emergence. The avoidant maintained their power partially through the assumption that you couldn't easily replace them, that while they had options, you were stuck with them or alone. This assumption allowed them to take you for granted with minimal fear of consequences. But their overplaying has led to a moment where replacement becomes real rather than theoretical. Maybe you've met someone else who shows genuine interest and availability. Maybe you've simply rebuilt your life in ways that no longer have space for someone who can't commit. Either way, the avoidant suddenly sees that they're not irreplaceable, that you have options, and that those options might actually be better than what they've been offering. The emergence of replacement anxiety destroys the avoidant's sense of security. They've been operating as if they were the catch, the prize, the one doing you a favor by maintaining contact. But now they see that you're the catch, that other people recognize your value in ways they failed to, that their strategic unavailability has created space for someone else to step in. This recognition creates panic that cuts through their normal defenses. The avoidant might suddenly become more attentive, more available, more openly affectionate. They're trying to compete with the threat of replacement, trying to prove they can be what you need. But this sudden change comes across as reactive rather than genuine, as fear-based rather than care-based. The replacement anxiety also forces the avoidant to confront what they actually feel about you. As long as your availability was guaranteed, they could avoid examining whether they wanted you or just wanted to know you were available. But the threat of losing you to someone else penetrates their defensive structure. They realize they're about to lose something they didn't think they cared about losing, and this realization brings up feelings they've been suppressing. The avoidant might discover they actually care deeply, that their detachment was protective performance rather than authentic indifference. but this discovery comes too late. Their overplaying has created a situation where their actual feelings don't matter anymore because they've depleted your capacity to care about those feelings. The history versus reality confrontation. The avoidant assumed that the history you share, the time invested, the memories created would keep you tethered regardless of how they behaved. They treated history as a security blanket, something that guaranteed you'd always give them another chance because of what you've been through together. This assumption allowed them to coast on past connection without maintaining present effort. But their overplaying has led you to a realization that devastates this assumption. History doesn't obligate you to accept an unsatisfying present. The past was good, but the present is unacceptable, and that's what matters. You're no longer staying because of what was. You're making decisions based on what is. The confrontation between history and reality hits the avoidant when they try to evoke shared memories or remind you of good times as a way to pull you back in. They expected nostalgia to soften you, to make you remember why you loved them, to override your current dissatisfaction. But instead of softening, you acknowledge the history while maintaining your boundaries about the present. You can appreciate what was while refusing to accept what is. The avoidant is forced to confront that history has run out of power, that they can no longer trade on past connection to excuse present unavailability. They need to be different now, not just remind you that they were once better. The confrontation also includes the avoidant realizing that all the work you've done to maintain the relationship, all the patience you've shown, all the accommodations you've made, don't obligate you to continue doing those things forever. The avoidant assumed your past investment meant you'd keep investing. But you've reached a point where past investment is a reason to stop rather than continue. You've given enough. You've tried enough. The history is a catalog of your effort and their taking, and looking at that history clearly reveals a pattern you're no longer willing to continue. The avoidant overplayed their hand by failing to reciprocate when reciprocation might have mattered. And now history works against them rather than for them. The desperation and dignity loss. As the avoidant realizes they're actually losing you, they often do something they've never done before. They pursue openly. They reach out repeatedly, express feelings they've always guarded, make promises about change. This desperation is a complete reversal of their usual controlled distance, and it's deeply uncomfortable for them. They're doing exactly what they've always avoided, revealing need and vulnerability, positioning themselves as the one who wants more. The pursuit feels humiliating because it contradicts their entire identity as someone who doesn't need relationship, who can take or leave connection. But panic overrides pride, and they find themselves chasing in ways they've scorned when others did it. The loss of dignity from desperate pursuit creates a shame spiral for the avoidant. They're not just losing you. They're losing their sense of themselves as the detached, controlled, unbothered person. They're becoming what they've always looked down on. Someone who needs, someone who begs, someone whose defenses have collapsed into raw desperation. This loss of identity compounds the loss of relationship. The avoidant is discovering that their game only worked when they maintained the performance of not caring. Once they show they care, once they reveal they've been affected, the power dynamic they relied on disintegrates completely. They're just another person who pushed someone away and regrets it, and that ordinariness is its own form of devastation. The dignity loss also means the avoidant can no longer return to the previous dynamic even if you were willing. They've shown their hand. They've revealed they care, they need, they're affected. This vulnerability can't be unseen or taken back. Even if reconciliation happens, it will be on different terms because the fiction of their indifference has been destroyed. The avoidant overplayed their hand so severely that in trying to recover, they've demolished the very defenses that made them feel safe in relationship. They're naked in ways they've spent their life avoiding, and the exposure is terrifying, regardless of whether it leads to reconnection or loss. The life without them reality. The most devastating consequence of the avoidant overplaying their hand is watching you build a life that doesn't include them and seeing that you're not just surviving, but thriving. The avoidant assumed that losing them would devastate you, that you'd collapse without their presence, that their absence would prove how much you needed them. But instead, they watch you create stability, pursue opportunities, develop connections, and find happiness in spaces they're not part of. Your thriving without them destroys their narrative about being central to your well-being. It proves that they were an obstacle to your flourishing rather than a contributor to it. The reality of life without them forces the avoidant to confront that they were the problem in the dynamic. As long as you were struggling, trying to make things work, adapting yourself to their limitations, they could believe the relationship difficulties were shared responsibility or even primarily your fault. But watching you thrive in their absence proves that their avoidance, their unavailability, their refusal to commit was holding you back. You're better without them. This recognition is crushing because it means they were not just neutral in your life, but actively harmful. The avoidant can't escape the conclusion that they damaged something good through their inability to show up, and that damage pushed you toward a better life that excludes them. The life without them reality also eliminates the avoidance fantasy that you'll always be available if they ever become ready. They imagined that someday, maybe, when they'd worked through their issues or felt safer, you'd still be there waiting. But you're not waiting. You've moved forward. You've built something new. Even if the avoidant eventually develops capacity for the intimacy they couldn't provide before, the opportunity with you is gone. They overplayed their hand so completely that they've lost not just the present relationship, but the future possibility. The door isn't just closed, it's been replaced with a wall, and on the other side is a life you're living fully without them. The avoidant gambled that they could push you away repeatedly and you'd always come back. They lost. And the loss is permanent because you're not the same person who loved them anymore. You've grown beyond them, and their game is over.